I was born in 1945 in Scotland, in a coal mining community where my father and his father and his father had worked and lived in the coal mines. I was the youngest of four siblings, youngest by 10 years. They were all 10, 11, 12 years older than me. I came along after the World War II. My dad had been in the RAF during World War II, so I'm always a great rooter for that last child that comes along unexpectedly. Um, I was born in Kirkcaldy, Fife, a small town on the coast, which is erstwhile famous for also being the location where Adam Smith wrote A Wealth of Nations. I was an economics student, so it was kind of relevant that this was the first modern economics treatise, and it was the groundwork, the fundamental basis, if you will, for modern day capitalism. Another famous neighbor I had was Andrew Carnegie, that was born a couple of small villages over, who emigrated to the U.S. when he was a teenager. Everybody was a coal miner except the butcher and the baker, so it was a relatively confined community. It was, however, in the fields, so we had a lot of fields and hills around us. We used to, as boys, we used to go off and just play all day. It's interesting now where every child has to be accounted for every minute of the day. We would just leave in the morning and we would come back and be fed, and that was about it. So a pretty good childhood. I stayed there for the first 15 years, 16 years. The coal mines, which were the sole essence of why we were located where we were, in the late 50s, the early 60s, started to close down. They were becoming uneconomical. So the not only the primary means of employment, but the only means of employment for most of the town was going away. I already had an older brother and an older sister that had moved to the U.S. My brother, who was 13 years older than me, was an electrician in the coal mines. And he was the first one to look for a better life. And we had a distant uncle in New Jersey who was a lineman for public service. So Moyer, my brother, decided to emigrate on his own. He brought over his girlfriend, and they were married in New Jersey. Then my oldest sister and her husband moved over a few years later. And then a couple of years later, my dad's coal mine was closing down. So we pretty much had the choice of him going down to coal mines in England or emigrating to the U.S. Now, my parents were 52 years old at the time. So that was a big move for them. I didn't really appreciate it at the time. I was 16. What did I know? I thought going to America sounded pretty cool. We didn't have any money, no life savings, nothing. And it's interesting, only a couple of years ago I found a document when we were moving from our previous house to this one, and the bottom of a box, I don't know how it got there, I don't remember having seen it for decades, was 3 slips of paper that were in my dad's handwriting, and it detailed the expenses of emigrating to the U.S. And it was so many pounds for visa pictures, so many pounds for visa application, so many pounds for the medical, pounds sterling that is, cost. And the various ways we could come over. We could come over propeller plane, we could come over jet plane, we could come over in a steamliner. What were the costs during peak and what were the costs during off-peak? So, of course, we ended up taking the cheapest of the 7 or 8 alternatives and flying over by propeller plane in off-peak season. And that was in October 22nd, 1962. My dad had been a coal miner before he left during World War II, as had his father and his grandfather. It was a long tradition in the family. And by the way, thinking about predecessors and ancestors in Scotland, Kirker is not a Scottish name, although we've been in Scotland as long as our family records can go back. And the family folklore is, we have no idea, I have no idea if this is true or not, but my family folklore is that my father's father, my grandfather, was the illegitimate son of a Professor Moyer at Edinburgh University who got the housemaid pregnant. Now he was married and had children, and obviously something had to be done. So there was apparently a German gardener called Kirker in the household staff. I have no idea in 1890 what a German gardener was doing in Edinburgh, Scotland, but his name was called Kirker, so they married off the housemaid to the German gardener. And so we picked up the name Kirker, but essentially none of the blood. So the Edinburgh professor's name was Moyer. So my father's name was James Moyer Kirker. And my brother, who was born way before me, was also called James Moyer Kirker. In the U.S., you would say junior. We didn't use that term back then. And he was actually called, and still is, he's 84 years old now, he still is called Moyer by his nickname. So my dad, when he was called up, and he was a pretty talented guy, actually, for being a coal miner. He was a wonderful musician. He was very good at sports, and when he was drafted in World War II, when he enlisted in World War II, I guess, he ended up in the RAF as a pilot. Spent most of his time in Africa, and was shot up fairly badly in 1943. He had, at the time, anticipated, after we got out, perhaps going into commercial airlines, but he was medically discharged. He was not able to fly anymore, so he went back to the coal mines. And I think he was always somewhat bitter about that. But he continued to play the piano and was wonderful. He just had a very natural flow, a very natural touch. My oldest brother, also played professionally, but I couldn't manage chopsticks. My sisters could manage chopsticks, but that was not for me. So he came back and worked in the coal mines. And by the time we emigrated in 1962, he didn't really have any skills, So it was a really big leap for them. It was interesting because we landed in the U.S. literally in the middle of the Cuban Missile Crisis on, I think, what was probably the worst day, on October 22nd, 1962. And it was all there was in the news. People were literally finding, storied, bomb shelters, all sorts of things. And we thought, what have we done here, But it was coming from the coal mining region in Scotland to suburban New York City was a jaw-dropper for me, for all of us, actually. I mean, just coming out of what was then Idlewild Airport, and it's now JFK, they had giant glass doors, and they swung open in front of me, and I was startled. I'd never seen sliding glass doors before. Things like that. It was like, there's not much difference between Western Europe and the U.S. There's essentially no difference as far as quality, cost of living, and standard of living. In those days, though, post-World War II, there was a really big difference. And it was like coming to the land of plenty, where everything was bigger, better, faster, and in many cases cheaper. So all of us, the four of us that my brother and my oldest sister had come over on their own a couple of years prior to that, and it was my parents and myself and my sister. So the four of us came over together, and it was like coming to cornucopia. I mean, we couldn't believe how affluent, how convenient, how nice everything was here. We fell in love immediately with it. I went to high school. I went to high school. Started in November of my senior year, so a little more than half of my senior year in the U.S. high school. My stay in high school was interesting. I found the academic work quite easy. That was no problem at all. Socially, though, I really was a fish out of water. I thought I was, by nature I was a shy person to start with, but I couldn't believe how at ease and sociable American kids were. They were at ease with their teachers. They talked to their teachers like equals. They were just very socially adept in ways that I wasn't, and I don't think any of my Scottish friends were. So that was an interesting challenge. Having just literally come off the boat or come off the airplane, and having no money, and nobody in the family had gone to university, it was seen as entirely feasible for me because I'd always done pretty well in school. But having no money, My brother was instrumental in getting me a job in public service, the electric utility in Jersey, no, New Jersey, in the engineering office and the systems planning office, where engineers projected needs into the future and made sure that the infrastructure and the distribution system was in place to meet those anticipated needs looking forward. So it was an interesting job. And the plan was to go to Newark College of Engineering at night and get my engineering degree. So that wasn't so financially burdensome. That would have taken me 8 years, and it was a lot of work. And I was working with young engineers. My immediate boss was a guy called Rich Heber. He seemed old, but he couldn't have been much more than 26, 27, 28. He used to smoke this cigar with his crew cut, but he had graduated from Rutgers. And he kept saying to me, why are you here? And I said, I don't have any money, you know. He said, you should be in college. And I said, you know, it's a bridge too far for me at that point. He says, I said, don't worry about it. He says, apply for a scholarship, borrow money, work. You'll make that all right. And that's exactly what I did. I only applied to one school, Rutgers, and was accepted. And I got a scholarship that covered the tuition. And I worked at various jobs through the 4 years. And I borrowed money. I started at Rutgers in the fall of '64, so that would be the class of '68. It was an interesting transition for me going to college, too. Everything was sort of a shiny object for me in those years. I still just a young kid from the coal mines in Scotland.